I think that talking about substance use in brains is incredibly important. And I say this as somebody who grew up in a household where substance use was common. And I made a decision for myself when I was 15, and I didn't realize the impact that it would have on the rest of my life. I decided when I was 15 that I didn't want to use substances to cope, that I saw people in my life around me using substances, drugs and alcohol to help them get through life. But my impression was that it wasn't really helping them. And so I thought for myself that, for example, if I didn't know how to have fun without substances, then I didn't really know how to have fun. And I thought, if I'm going through a tough time, I want to figure out how to deal with this without using drugs or alcohol. Now, that's not to say that I never use drugs or alcohol when I'm going through a tough time, but that it's not my number one go-to choice. And part of the reason that I'm telling you this, or why I think it's important for you to hear, is because right now, as teenagers, your brain is going through one of the most critically important times in its development. So much is shifting and happening. Parts of your brain are coming online that have never been online before. Your brain is deciding what's important. It's strengthening some of its neural pathways with myelin sheath. It's really growing in this fantastic way. And right now at this period, not only are you able or interested in trying out new things and taking risks and curious about the world, and yeah, there's so much good, but also, for better or for worse, this is the time when you can have a direct impact on the way that your brain is wired. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you choose to use substances when you're a teenager, say around the age of 15, if you choose to use them often and regularly, and depending on the quantities as well, you could actually set up the neural pathways that can lead you to a life of addiction. In some ways, I think it's kind of unfair that 15-year-olds have to make decisions about substance use that could affect them for the rest of their lives. On the one hand, I understand that you want to explore it, and maybe you want to try new things. But on the other hand, it seems unfair that these choices now are going to set your brain up and put the patterns and the pathways in place. So my decision to not use at 15, and I didn't even know that this was happening in my brain, but my decision to not use substances as my primary coping mechanism when I was a teenager, that has served me incredibly well throughout the course of my life. Now, obviously, you were responsible for your choices, and your choices affect nobody but you. Or maybe I shouldn't say that, because our choice to use substances can actually affect a lot of the people around us. But maybe I should say that your choices to use substances affect you primarily, you more than anybody else. So the science shows that the younger you are when you start, and the more often you use, the more of an impact it will have on your brain. The more likely it is that you will set yourself up for a life of addiction. Every time you use, you're tapping into this reward center for your brain, which releases dopamine. And when our brain likes something, it starts to crave something. And the more we crave and the more we use, the more likely it is that we're going to develop a pattern of dependence or addiction on any substance. And this is true not just for cannabis or for alcohol, but it's true for the internet or our phones or different social media platforms. There's almost like a physical addiction that happens during these processes. So it's always important to be mindful of what we're consuming and how. I'm going to be talking about 3 of the effects of alcoholism in the brain in a minute. And we're going to use this model that was in your kit, and I'll show you the 3 different parts. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about your brain, your teenage brain. So the teenage brain is particularly susceptible or sensitive to the effects of alcohol. So one of the best things that you can do before using substances is to wait. And the longer you wait, the better it is for your brain. But if you can't wait, if you absolutely have to use a substance, whether it's alcohol or pot or something else, the less we use it, the better. So if you can wait, reduce the frequency, reduce the quantity that you're using, all of these things are incredibly helpful to the healthy development of your brain. And these patterns can help set you up for the rest of your life. So we've talked a bit about the teenage brain, but now we're going to talk about the effects of alcoholism on any brain. These are just three of the potential effects of alcoholism on the brain. We are talking about these three in particular because they're the ones that are shown on the brain model. So you'll notice that there's a little nodule here, right above the pons, right next to the midbrain. And there are two of them in the brain. There's one on each, one in each hemisphere of the brain, and these are known as the mammillary glands. Truthfully, they got the name mammillary because when they were discovered, and there were two of them, and they were small and round, it was decided that they looked a little bit like teeny tiny boobs. True story. So the mammillary body is just right here. And what can happen is with chronic alcohol consumption is that the mammillary bodies can actually shrink or atrophy. Now, what happens when these, do you see again right here? There it is. What happens when these atrophy? Well, it can actually impact a person's ability to recall memory or to create new memories. And it also impacts their spatial awareness. In particular, it gives them, or it can give them, a staggered gait, meaning that they're not walking that they can't walk in a straight line. Effect number 2 is brain hemorrhaging. You'll notice here that on this part of the brain model, let's see if I can get it in focus for you. There it is. That there are some teeny tiny dots, and these are meant to represent like blood clots and brain bleeds. So brain hemorrhaging is really just a fancy way to say brain bleeds. Now, what happens when somebody who drinks alcohol regularly and particularly large quantities of alcohol is it increases the blood pressure. But not only does it increase the blood pressure, it also makes it so that the heart beats irregularly. And with the irregular heartbeats, we're 5 times more likely to develop blood clot. Now, a blood clot is like this teeny tiny little jelly-like clump of blood. And what happens when these go through our bodies, if they reach our brain, they can get stuck in one of the veins, and then they can prevent the blood or stop the blood from traveling to other parts of our brain. And this can result in something that's known as a stroke. So not only is there an increased risk for stroke, but there's also, as I mentioned, high blood pressure, and alcohol creates thinner blood, and it prevents the blood from coagulating. Now, coagulating is just a fancy way to say thickening, so it stops the blood from thickening. You'll probably have seen this before when you cut yourself, and then the blood will become a little bit thick, and then eventually the bleeding will stop. It's because the blood has coagulated, and so it's our body's natural ability to stop itself from bleeding to death. But when there are large amounts of alcohol and our blood is thin and our blood can't thicken, not only are we at an increased risk for stroke, but if there is a brain bleed or hemorrhaging in the brain, then it is less likely that our body is going to be able to stop that bleeding all by itself. And these kinds of stroke, these brain hemorrhages, can ultimately lead to somebody dying. Effect number 3. Cerebellum atrophy. So this is the cerebellum here at the bottom, at the back of our brain. And you'll notice that there's one on each side and that they're a little bit different in that this one is smaller. And that's to show you the effect of a shrunken cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is responsible for body movement in particular. And what happens when it atrophies or when it shrinks is that in part, a person is unable to have the same amount of control over their body function or their body movement. And unfortunately, once the cerebellum atrophies, it can't repair itself. One of the beautiful things about the brain is that it's constantly growing and shifting, and we can change our brains. We can intentionally change our brains. We can heal trauma and remove those patterns from our brain. We can learn new healthy coping strategies. We can learn new ways to relate to people. We can even shrink the size of our amygdala, which is responsible for a flight and fight response. I think this is truly remarkable. And truthfully, as soon as we stop drinking alcohol chronically, our brain immediately goes into repair mode, meaning that it starts to rebuild and regrow and repair parts of our brain that have been damaged by substance use. But unfortunately, not all of the effects of substance use or substance abuse are reversible, such as with the cerebellum. It can't repair itself, no matter how much you might want it to. It's just not something that the brain can do. So I think it's important to remember that as you're making these choices of whether or not to use, that some of the long-term effects of alcoholism in particular, but some of the long-term effects of substance use are irreversible. Again, I'm not telling you this stuff because I'm trying to scare you into not drinking. What I'm hoping is that with more information, you can make the decisions that are right for you in this moment. Maybe in this moment and hopefully long term. And just to know that the choices that you're making today will affect your tomorrows. So if you do choose to use, just start low and go slow. Thanks for watching.